the Corinthians, he made the point that he had not taken any money from them in order to avoid offense. But he also uses this expression that you shall not muzzle the ox that treads out the corn, the laborer is worthy of his hire, all of it meaning that it's possible for a minister to be compensated for the work that he does. Ironically, as I said, he tells Timothy this. Now, in the Church of God International, we are trying our best to adopt a policy that ministers will not be compensated by the congregations that they serve. The reasons being, I don't think you have to do too much thinking to figure out the problems that you can get involved in. If a minister, let's say you get to the place where up here in Redding or Red Bluff, we've got a church that meets up here and it's now up to 250 people, regular attendance, or maybe even 300 or 400. And you kind of hire yourself a pastor, and you all get together and you vote on what his salary ought to be, and you're paying him, and he's doing a job working, vigorously around the church. He comes upon a situation regarding, let's say, discipline, where a given church member is concerned, which he has to retain in confidence, because he cannot disclose to people who are not involved in it the things that he's aware of involved in this particular item of discipline. And he takes certain steps relative to a church member, who then proceeds to go to other church members to complain and moan and groan and look for sympathy and to misrepresent the way in which the minister handled it. Now, nobody would ever do that, would they? Yeah. Some of you grinning, you know better. You know people will do that sort of thing. Next thing you know, we're all beginning to put pressure on this minister because, after all, we pay him. And he falls into that category of, which I'll talk about another time, minister as employee. And that is employee of the local church. The simplest and the most obvious concern people have, if a man's paid by the congregation and he can't preach, necessarily what's on his heart and his mind, he has to preach what they tell him. Well, that isn't really true. Most ministers worth their salt will get up there and preach it to you anyway, even if they're going to lose their job. There'll come a point in time when they're just not going to be compromised beyond that. But there are a lot of other subtle ways in which a minister can be influenced, and if not influenced, he may not be able to be influenced, but he can be hurt. And he can be mistreated. A minister can be mistreated just like people can be mistreated. And so our policy basically is, I think, going to be that the ministry will not be even asking for expenses from a local congregation, but will be getting their expenses from the home office under supervision of other ministers who will judge whether or not they're doing their job right. And if they're not doing the job right, they will be called up short on the matter of not doing that job right. But that compensation, which is right and is proper, and we intend certainly to have salaried field ministry as there is need and as we have resources. That is very much a part of the ongoing long-term plan. But one of the great blessings we have got is in many areas we've got ministers who serve basically out their own time and have their own jobs. It's very rare that we have a full-time man like we have Mr. Phillips in an area who can work over an area as freely as he can. Most of our fellows in the field are working at their own job all week, and the weekend comes, and a lot of times on weeknights, and they go out and they serve the church. And I think that's really a very, very good thing, and it has served, I think, many of them very well in demonstrating their sincerity and the fact that the people know that they want to help out in that church and to be a minister in their truest sense of the word. In 2 Timothy chapter 1, he says, "You therefore, my son, be strong in the grace that is in Jesus Christ, and the things that you have heard of me among many witnesses, the same commit you to faithful men who shall be able to teach others also." This is a fundamental duty of the ministry, is to recruit faithful men, and I might add faithful women. I don't think in this particular case we want to talk in terms of men only, because faithful women in the Bible, Paul mentions them, Luke mentions them, the number of faithful women in the church who had a great deal of influence on the direction of the church, what the church accomplished. I have Aquila and Priscilla, a married couple, both of whom are always mentioned together because they were a team and they worked well together and they were very important to the early church. But one of our jobs in the ministry is to recruit faithful people and to commit to these people the things that we know, to pass on our experience, to pass on our knowledge, to carry out, and to see to it that the things that were delivered to these original apostles, which were then delivered to others, which was somewhere down the line delivered to me and to Mr. Phillips, we have an obligation to in turn deliver to you. And, yes, we have an obligation to deliver it to you as just every member of the church. But then on the other hand, there are people in the church who are just more committed than other people are. There are people, for example, who will get in their cars and drive a long distance at night to hear a Bible study in the middle of the week, and other people who just frankly would not do that, maybe cannot do it for whatever reason. But then there are, and this, you begin to see with people that there are people who are more committed than others, and it's these people over time that we want to nurture, and to teach, and to train wherever possible, in order to just create this set of undergirding and pillars, like pier and beam foundations, to where you have, your piers all laid in there, and you lay those beams on top of them, and you can construct an edifice on top of it that isn't going to be coming down around your ears, or being blown down by every bit of wind that comes along. And the foundation stones, who never move, are very important in the construction of your home, I think, which all of you who've ever built a house understand, and know how important it is to get that part of it right in the first place. If it's not right, everything else goes wrong. And so that's one of the things that I'm right here doing tonight, is working on that foundation. Mr. Phillips.
In Ephesians 4, where we started,
yeah,
where it says He gave some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, for the perfecting of the saints. Some translations, especially in the Greek, since it doesn't have any commas or periods or anything, it just one have, I think, a better rendering of that, where it says, "For the perfecting of the saints unto the work of the ministry." So it's the job of the pastor and the teacher to train the people. Well, what did Christ say? Go out and make disciples of all. To actually do it.
Right, to actually train ministers.
Yeah.
And I use the word minister in this sense in a very broad term.
Yes, not just ordained
right.
elders.
And it's in this sense that women are in the ministry as well as men. Because while the Bible says, I do not, Paul said, I do not suffer the woman to teach nor to usurp authority over the man. It does not mean that women are not to teach women or children. They very much are to do so. He said, in other places, he says, let the older women teach the younger women in the church. Some people wondered, and asked the question, it was why I was sending this baptism counseling tape out to women. They asked, well, can women baptize? And I said, well, I really don't know the answer to that for sure. I said, but one thing I do know for a fact, that there will be women who will come along in time in the future of the church who will be more comfortable talking to you women about certain aspects of baptism than they would be to me or Mr. Phillips. And if you know the answer to the question when they ask you, you're positioned to help them in a way that I cannot. Now, do you think that's important? Sure it is. When you get those tapes ultimately, which you will if you enroll, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. It's not necessarily to train you to baptize somebody. It's to put you, to position you so that when someone comes along with a question, you'll be able to answer that question. Be able to help them, to give them some encouragement, to tell them, no, what's happening to you has happened to a lot of people, and you ought not to be discouraged by it, and here's why, and to be able to explain in your way and from your life and from your perspective. I think you'll find the baptism counseling tapes will help you make sense out of some things that have happened to you in your life that you may not have fully understood. No, okay. So now I want you to turn back to some other scriptures here before we close off tonight. And if any of you have to leave before I'm finished here, I'll certainly will understand. In Hebrews, the 13th chapter, there are two verses that I think we have to look at and ponder over a little bit. And then we want to put them with another scripture. Hebrews 13, verse 7. Remember them which have the rule over you, who have spoken unto you the word of God, whose faith follow, considering the end of their conversation, Jesus Christ the same, yesterday, today, and forever, be not carried about with divers and strange doctrines. I really believe that all comes together. The statement about not being carried about with doctrines is the same one we saw back in Ephesians 4, remember? Not being blown about by every wind of doctrine. And it was related there to the ministry, and it's related here to the ministry. Remember them that have the rule over you, who have spoken to you the word of God. Now, then it goes on a little later in verse 17 and says, obey them that have the rule over you, and submit yourselves. Now, we can argue about the meaning of words till the cows come home, but there is something here, isn't there? Obey them that have the rule over you, and submit yourselves. For they watch for your souls as they that must give account, that they may do it with joy and not with grief, for that is unprofitable for you. Now, this would cause concern to a lot of people who have had the worldwide Church of God experience, wouldn't it? Because they have seen this rule abused over God's people. And quite bitterly. Now, yet what are we to do with these scriptures? You know, are we to imagine that they are not here? How are we to understand them? Well, how are we to cope with them? I want to read you one more scripture, and then I'd like to hear from you on this as to what you think about these statements in relation to what we're going to read over here in 1 Peter. In 1 Peter chapter 5, he says, "The elders which are among you I exhort, who am also an elder, and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and a partaker of the glory that shall be revealed. Feed the flock of God which is among you, taking the oversight thereof, not by constraint, but willingly, not for filthy lucre or money, but with a ready mind." In other words, while he tells Timothy on the one hand, see to it that the elders are compensated and the ones that do well are compensated better, he tells those men who are doing the work, he says, I don't want you doing this because of the compensation. And I don't necessarily want you working better because you think you're going to make more money at it. That's not why we're doing this. Neither, he says, as being lords over God's heritage. Now, whatever we are as ministers, we are not lords over the church. Whatever ruling over the church means, it doesn't mean that, does it? So there is some mitigation of this thing in the warning that is given to me. In a sense, what he says to the church in Hebrews is, what you need to do is to voluntarily submit yourself to those who are in positions of responsibility in the church so the work can get done effectively. Then he says to those in positions of responsibility, I don't want you abusing that responsibility over these people. That's, you kind of get a little balance in what Paul is trying to say. Don't fight your minister. Don't try to cut his legs off. Don't work against him behind his back. These kind of things do go on from time to time. He said, but you're doing wrong. Because there is leadership in the church. The leadership is invested in the ministry. And we're going to have to work this way or we're going to wind off going 150 different directions and being ineffective. Now, does that mean that there are no checks and balances? We want that to be in the Church of God. But what do you do if you believe your minister is wrong? Is that hard? You know what to do? What would you do if you believed he was wrong? What's the first thing you do if you believed he was wrong? Or maybe I should say, should do.
Imagine you'd have to go to somebody higher up and be able to answer that question.
Wouldn't you like to talk to him about it first?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. You're just overlooking the obvious, really. Yeah, you go talk to him about it. That's the first thing you do. Then sit down and talk about it. Say, maybe I'm wrong. It's hard to get in trouble with those words. We initiate the conversation. I may be wrong, but here's what I thought, and I'd like to hear what you got to say about it. Would you get upset with somebody coming to you that said, I may be wrong, but I think you made a mistake?
I don't know.
Not sure about that. There was a time in my life I might have had more trouble with that than I do now. Nowadays, I think, well, just say on, brother. I appreciate the fact you come to me instead of going to a bunch of other people about it. I really would. And if you go to that and you can't get it resolved, then the Scripture says you go back and take a witness. If you still can't get it resolved, well, then it says take it to the church. Now, what does that mean, you suppose? Well, we could argue about what that might mean and the implications of that, but I will tell you one thing. If you take it to the local assembly and try to resolve it, you will succeed in dividing your church. You'll just split it like you did it with a meat cleaver. What we recommend you do in taking it to the church is that you bring it to the ministry. To those of us who have been in the ministry longer, have the experience in the ministry, and who have accepted responsibility for your minister. Because if a minister carries a credential that says he is a Church of God International minister, the ministry of the Church of God International accept responsibility for that man. We're responsible for him. And we will look after our own. If our own have to be disciplined, we'll discipline them. If they have to be removed from ministry, we'll do it. We may not do it as fast as you would like for us to, because there are, the Bible says don't move too quickly on matters like this, because things can, you can get blindsided if you're not careful. It says don't receive an accusation against an elder except before 2 or 3 witnesses. My advice to people is back your minister up as far as you can and as long as you can. And if it comes down to the place where you can't do it anymore after you've talked to him and haven't gotten anywhere, well, then consult us down in Tyler about the matter, and we'll see if we can't help you out. That's a commitment that we make when we say this man is one of our boys, and we vouch for him. And if he goes bad, we'll try to deal with him. Ministers can go bad. It's a fact of life, a hateful fact of life, but a real one nevertheless. He said, we're not to be lords over God's heritage, but examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd shall appear, you shall receive a crown of glory that fades not away. Likewise, you younger, submit yourselves to the elder. Yea, all of you be subject one to another, and be clothed with humility, for God resists the proud, and gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time. Now, this is kind of funny in a way, because what does he mean, you younger, submit yourselves to the elder? Yea, all of you be subject one to another. I think what he's talking about here is younger ministers being subject to older ministers, and all of us who are in the ministry being subject one to another. The passage here is addressed to the elders of the church, the whole package that is put in here. Even when it gets down to saying, be sober and be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, goes about like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. After all, the first place he went was to Jesus himself. And obviously, the second place for him to attack in the church is the ministry, the most obvious place, because it's where he can do the greatest damage to the most number of people with the least amount of effort. So he said, look out and resist him, being steadfast in the faith, knowing that the same afflictions are accomplished by your brethren that are in the world. That little phrase right there makes it very clear to you, to me at least, that he's talking to the ministry. Because if he's talking to the church when he says that, it doesn't mean anything. You are one of my brethren who are in the world. You're out there facing the world every day. I'm not. I go a whole week, never meet an unconverted person. And then I go to church, meet the church there. I work in the office. There are a few unconverted church members around, I guess, but nevertheless, that's the way it is. I'm not in the world in the way that you are in the world. A field minister may not even be in the world quite like you are. So this admonition is given to the ministry to be careful about all these things, to be subject to one another, and that is, this being subject one to another is the heart and core of ministerial discipline. That we are to discipline ourselves and are to discipline one another in the interest of maintaining unity in the church. Now, what do you do, though, if your minister goes bad and there's nobody around? 3 John, remember? Here's a classic situation. Minister went bad and there was nobody around. We'll kind of try to wind up with this and not keep you too late. 3 John, he begins in verse 9 by saying, I wrote to the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to have the preeminence among them, receives us not. Wherefore, if I come, I will remember his deeds which he does, prating against us with malicious words, and not content therewith, he doesn't receive the brethren, and forbids them that would, and casts them out of the church. Beloved, don't follow what is evil. Follow what is good. He that does good is of God. He that does evil has not seen God. Demetrius has a good report of all men and of the truth itself. Yea, and we also bear a record, and you know our record is true. What do you hear here? Is there anything that interests you of this that you can see here in the light of what we've been saying tonight that might be important? Did you notice the fact he did not tell them to try to solve the problem with Diotrephes themselves? He said, if I come, I will not forget, I'll remember the things that he has done. The implication is, when I get there, I will handle Diotrephes. What did he tell them? He said, follow that, don't follow what's wrong, follow what's good. That if they happen to still be attending where Diotrephes were and he gets up and preach, don't follow him in the areas he's wrong. You know what they are. Follow what's good. And then he says, now Demetrius is a man of good report of all men and the truth itself, and I vouch for Demetrius. He said, I realize that many of you can no longer have anything to do with Diotrephes. Follow Demetrius, hang around Demetrius. Demetrius has a good report. Work with him until I get there, and I will deal with it. That's a pretty low-key way of solving the problem. He did not advocate confrontation. He did not advocate trying to tear up your local church. And indeed, there could be a situation, fortunately, you're not going to have to face this kind of thing because I know the man that's here. But in some different places around the country, you might come to the place to where you would conclude that there was no point in making that first visit to the minister. There just was no point. There was no point in anybody going to Diotrephes one-on-one. They weren't going to get anywhere. In fact, I gather the first people that went to him one-on-one were thrown out of the church. So there was nothing for them to do at that particular point in time. And I would say that there could be circumstances where that might happen, unfortunately, to one of our little local churches somewhere around the country someday. And when that time comes, don't make an issue out of it. Don't hurt the church further. Don't create a confrontation which would turn off and destroy a lot of little ones. Let the ministry handle it. Wait for John. Form yourself, get together with people that you do feel comfortable with and you can trust. Do what's right. Don't do what's wrong. I think I said something not dissimilar to that myself recently in a sermon on the subject. I said, just keep on doing what's right, no matter what the people around you are doing. I know that's simplistic, but I don't know where I could ever give you any better advice on any of that sort of thing, right? Okay, we are continuing now on the material that we had. After having summarized earlier all the things, now I want you to turn back to the 15th chapter of the book of Acts. Because here we have, I think, a fascinating illustration of something that's very important in understanding not only the ministry, but how the ministry relates to the church. The 15th chapter of Acts, a problem had arisen once again. And oddly enough, the apostles didn't always perceive or anticipate these problems. They didn't often get a chance to handle them until after they had arisen and been a problem. But in Acts, the 15th chapter, are we still going? Okay. In Acts, the 15th chapter, it says, certain men came down from Judea. Now, this is in the church in Antioch. And they taught the brethren and said, except you be circumcised after the manner of Moses, you cannot be saved. I mean, Paul must have made a big round hole in the roof about the time these people showed up and started doing it. He knew better than that. And when Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and disputation, and I dare say that's true, what I can tell about Paul, with them, they determined that Paul and Barnabas and certain other of them should go to Jerusalem unto the apostles and elders about this question. What does that tell you? Let me ask you, pardon?
They disagreed.
Well, yeah, they disagreed.
Church authority.
Yeah, why were they going down to Jerusalem about this? Well, it did. There's no doubt about that. Let me ask you this. Did the church in Antioch consider itself an autonomous church? Plainly not. Did they consider themselves independent of Jerusalem? Plainly not. They actually realized that there was some authority down there. Now, what is interesting is they didn't say, we're just going to Jerusalem about this, or to the apostles about this. They said, we're going to the apostles and the elders about this. Now, isn't that interesting? Because there were elders in Antioch at this time. Now, elders used in this sense means not merely older people in the congregation. It means the overseers of the congregation. Elder is essentially the same as the Greek word for bishop, which means overseer. Bishop is a Greek concept. Elder is a Jewish concept, essentially for the same thing. These people were the overseers down there. Now, in a sense, and this is something I think we have to think about. Sometimes if you don't think, you just read these things and don't give them any thought, you can come up with some wrong conclusions. In a sense, there was a hierarchy of influence in the church at this time. Hierarchy is a bad word, but let's be realistic about what existed at that time. Do you suppose it's possible that the 12 apostles in Jerusalem were more influential in the church than any elder, bishop, or what have you in Antioch, in the church at large? Well, of course they were. Obviously, the original 11 in particular were the most influential men in Christendom. And I'm sure Matthias was also very influential, but I expect he even lost a little bit by virtue of the fact of not having been among the original 12, although he would rather not been there than to have had to been the one who betrayed Christ. Although Paul considered himself their equal in authority, Paul was not equal in influence. Think about it. He had to keep fighting for his apostleship. He had to argue with churches about it. He had to explain things to people. And it's obvious. He wasn't among the original 12. He was an apostle out of due season. There were a lot of people who didn't even believe he was an apostle along the way. So he, did not have the influence that those men had. Now, there is a natural priority of time involved in human group relationships. Earlier, therefore influential. You come into a small group of people, or who've been there for a long time, you're the new guy. You don't have the influence that people have who have been there for a long time. And as a generalization, people who have been in the group longer have more influence than people who have been in the group a lesser period of time. That's a realistic, assumption, isn't it? So therefore, we can assume that the people in Jerusalem, as a whole, had been Christians a lot longer than anybody else had. The 3,000 of them have been Christians since the first day the Holy Spirit fell on the church down there. Those people, had been around earlier and therefore were more influential. There is also, and that, by the way, that also relates to experience. There is an influence that comes about from perceived experience. You've done this before. What do you think? As opposed to someone who has never done it before at all. There's also a natural priority of centricity, which is like saying this person is central, therefore influential. Now, central doesn't have to be geographical. Central can have to do more with what's up here in your head and where the information crosses in all the local, a person who sits at the center of all the paths of information is a very influential person because he has knowledge, and knowledge is influence. Knowledge about the Bible is influence. Knowledge about people is influence. All these things are involved with being able to exercise influence in a church. Jerusalem elders were more influential than elders in Antioch. They were central. They were earlier in everything. They had more experience. So they get up there and they want to know, well, what does Jerusalem think about this thing that's going on? We need to know. Okay? Later, Paul will demonstrate a different kind of influence on the churches he started. It's a kind of founder's influence. After all, he came in there. He's the first one that preached the gospel to these people. He started these churches. He was their teacher, their mentor, the one they respected. He had seen Christ. They had not. All these things. He was earlier than they were. Paul had an enormous influence, but he came to them and said, look, if nobody else is enough, if I'm not an apostle to anybody else, I've got to be to you people. I started these churches. He was appealing to founders' influence, wasn't he? In that way. Okay? There's also an influence that grows out of demonstrated fruits. We might call it respect. In other words, you see a person do these things. He's performing his job. He has helped you. And out of these fruits grow a kind of a tenuous thing we call respect. Now, something not unlike this early hierarchy of influence that existed in the church prevails in the Church of God International. And it's not there because of any divine edict. It is there because of the way people are and the way people relate to one another. For example, Garner Ted Armstrong is early. Now, he's been in the ministry longer than any of us have been in the ministry. Ted Phillips is older than Ted. And so is Carl Fritz. He's older than you are. But when it comes to being an elder in the ministry, Ted is the eldest of us all. So he is the earliest, and therefore he has a considerable amount of influence as a result of that. He has more experience. Certainly in his line of work, way a lot more experience than any of the rest of us have got. But even the ministry he does. Therefore, he exercises an enormous amount of influence from that. He is central. He is at the heart and core, right where the core of things is being done. And Tyler is far more central than above in the CGI way of thinking about things. We're not, don't think of ourselves in terms of being at the top of a pyramid. We think of ourselves as being at the center of spokes of a wheel, is the way we look at ourselves down there. We are, for better or for worse, at the center. So Ted is at the center. Ted is influential because of that. He is, of course, respected, and he gets a lot of influence out of that. He is very good at what he does. The fruits are there. The demonstrated experience is there. I am early. I've been around for a long time. I celebrated the 25th anniversary of my ordination this year at the Feast of Tabernacles. I'm getting along, in years in the ministry now. I can CGI. I'm second only to Garner Ted Armstrong in being early, and therefore I am influential. I've got a lot of experience that people recognize, and that experience gives me a considerable amount of influence where people are concerned. I'm told that I am respected in the church because of the gifts that God's given me as a teacher, and that gives me, a lot of influence among people. There are, of course, the other kinds of influence that come along with this, which is just the power of persuasion. Some people have it and some people don't. And that makes you influential if you have the capacity to influence the behavior of other people. Now, others in Tyler, Larry Watkins, Ian Houghton, Vance Stinson, Charles Gross, all have different measures of these early and late in experience and respect and what they've been able to gain and what they haven't, but they're all central. And they all then have a measure of influence beyond what they themselves would have if they were not central, right? So now you begin to, if you can kind of translate that back to the first century, you realize that, look, we'd better go down to Jerusalem to find out what's going on this. Because if the church is going to swing into this new direction, we'd all better be speaking the same thing, or we're going to have nothing but trouble on our hands. We up here in Antioch, we decide we're going to change things around and we're going to go this direction, and we find out that Jerusalem is not, we've got a lot of trouble. And it's going to be defeating. And we're probably going to split the church, among other things, that are going to take place. So they realized we got to go down and ask. Now when people ask, what does Tyler think about it? They are doing almost the same thing that the people did up in Antioch. They are recognizing the relationships that exist in the church, and I think relationships that Christ put in the ministry as realities of life. As to if we're going to function as a national and international church, then what's going on at the center is important. And it's important that if we come up with a new idea, that we persuade the center, that it is right, so that they can help us persuade people on the other end of the wheel that it's right, so that if we're going to speed this thing up or we're going to slow it down, we can do it all at once. For guess what happens when you speed up part of a wheel and don't speed up the rest of it? It breaks. It's all it can do is break down. There is nothing else that can happen to it unless we work together. It's not the best analogy, but it's the best I can do for right now. But people are quite right, in the church and asking, what does Jerusalem think about it? Or what does Tyler think about it if we're dealing with a question of controversy that might exist in the church? Apart from any fears of authoritarianism, it is very difficult to effect meaningful change from anywhere except the center. Now, we've talked about this a great deal. We even had a regional ministerial conference out here in California once. And some of the fellows wanted to discuss some doctrinal questions at that conference that Ted and I were simply not prepared to discuss. We had not really ourselves been able to spend the time on them, so all we could have done was just listen, and we wouldn't have gotten anywhere with it at that. But I got to thinking about that, in my own, and I was the one that came up with the idea of regional conferences, and I was the one that came up with the idea of let's don't do it anymore, beyond the kind of thing that we're doing here. And the reason I did that was because, think about it this way. All the ministers over in South Carolina, I go over there and Ted goes over there, and we have a conference over in South Carolina and North Carolina with all the Carolina ministers over there on the East Coast. And we get deep into some of these doctrinal questions, and we come up with some new concepts regarding biblical typology and the holy days and the meaning of some things and so forth. And we come to a unanimous conclusion over there that this is right. What are we going to do about it? We haven't asked Ted. He may have a thought or two. We haven't asked Lauren about it. We don't know how they feel about it. But see what we did. Well, let's get down to a national conference and we'll discuss it there. Okay, fine. But what happens then is all the Carolina ministers come into the conference as a block. Because they have all decided. How easy do you think it is going to be to convince all those folks that they really weren't wrong after all? Is there a chance they might just have been wrong after all? Yes, there is. There certainly is. Then isn't it really kind of better if we all discuss these things together? Well, at our size of ministry as we are right now, you better believe it is. There just aren't that many of us that we need to break ourselves up into regions and conferences and discuss doctrines and so forth. That's a surefire way to get ourselves running off in 5 or 6 different directions. And it just really is not necessary at this time in the ministry, in the work. It's too easy for all of us to get together in one place and discuss these things together in one place. We had a beautiful conference last year, and I anticipate one just, even better this year as ministers get together to discuss things that they think are important for the church. And as I say, I've said to others, I will say also to you, that we will accept papers being submitted from people who are not in the ministry if people want to submit them. I can conceive of the fact that we would get a paper so good from a layperson someday that we would invite that layperson to come to the conference and present it to the ministry. That could easily happen. That hasn't yet, but that doesn't mean it won't. So, as I said, you really have got to be able to get people together. Now, there are some alternatives. You don't have to do things this way. People are going to say, who cares what Jerusalem thinks up in Antioch? And you want to bet somebody didn't? So I says, who cares what we mean go to Jerusalem about this thing? Who cares what they think down there? Do we have to do what Jerusalem says? You reckon anybody in Antioch asked that question? We have to do what they say down there in Jerusalem? Jerusalem, do you suppose anybody said, Jerusalem's not going to tell us what to do up here? But guess what? They all went down to Jerusalem. They discussed this whole thing out. And when all was said and done, James said, now let me see if I've got this straight. Here's what I see everybody saying here. My sentence is that we trouble not those from among the Gentiles that are turning to Christ, that we write to them along these lines, and we make this ruling, along these very narrow lines, and let's write this up in a letter, and let's deliver this to all the churches. Do you think the churches were expected to obey that? Well, sure they were. That was expected to become binding upon the church at large when that decision was made. That was a judgment, and it went into the traditions of the church. And at that time, in that place, in those circumstances, it took on the force of law. You notice those words, at that time, and in that place, in those circumstances? What am I talking? Situation ethics? No, not really. If you want to know what I'm talking about, read the article that's coming up in the upcoming Watch magazine on observing the Sabbath and Sabbath observance. Because in it I explain a great deal about this question of judgments, the minister's responsibility, the ministry's responsibility in rendering judgments for the church and directions for the church in matters just like what they faced up there in Antioch. It was a matter of controversy within their gates. The ministry solved it. They made a decision, and the people obeyed the decision, and off we went. Now, naturally, there were some people who didn't, but, we can't do much about them. They were free to do whatever they pleased. Now, what about the question of independent churches in the 20th century? We live in a time when we've had to see the church split in a lot of different directions. We're not attending with the Worldwide Church of God anymore. And there are churches that were with us at one time that aren't with us anymore. There are individuals who were with us at one time that are not with us anymore. Can independent churches really exist? Is it all right with God for there to be such a thing as an independent church? Let me ask you the question another way. Is it all right with God for there to be such a thing as an independent Christian? Can an independent Christian exist? See one head shaking. Anybody disagree? Ted?
Why is he independent?
Now that's an important question.
Where is he too far away?
Now we know, don't we, that you can survive, or there's an independent Christian. It's possible. How do we know that?
What do you mean by independence? You mean without a minister?
Yeah, without a minister, without even another Christian, alone in a cave.
No.
Sure you can. If not, why was Philip sent way out of his way to baptize the Ethiopian eunuch, who would be the only Christian in Ethiopia? Why? So it's possible, But good grief, where was the man? He was in Ethiopia. Where are you? Now, certainly you can exist without a church. We got people all over this country who do. They live up in Wyoming and out in Idaho, and they live 150 miles from any local church. However, they don't consider themselves independent. They consider themselves part of the church, which is an assembly of people. Now, as I've said before, I will say again, and I can't emphasize it enough, independence is not a Christian virtue. This goes contrary to our grain because we are Americans. We're proud of our independence. We declared our independence way back when. We think in terms of being independent as a good thing and a courageous and a right thing to be. But in the Bible, in the letters, in the New Testament letters, the people are told again and again and again to depend on one another. Aren't they? They were taught to be interdependent. And the church is an interdependent relationship. Very much so. It is not a loose connection of fiercely individual people. Because if it were, how would those people among us who needed our help ever get our help if we have to keep ourselves sort of apart from people? Independence is not a Christian virtue. Interdependence is what the church is built upon. I depend on you, and you depend on me. I cry with you when you're hurt, and you laugh with me when I'm having a good time. This is one of the things that binds us together, and togetherness is a Christian virtue. It is at the fundamental base of what the church is all about, isn't it? Okay. Now let's take that reasoning a step further. What about the independent church? What about that? Can that exist?
Why do they want to be independent?
Why would a church want to be independent? Okay, are there any good reasons? Why would a church want to be independent?
Well, it's like the body. If the pancreas decided to be independent,
that's what. Not long. My finger will not even last long without me, much less my pancreas. I wouldn't last very long, possibly without my pancreas either. Yes.
Maybe expanding it too far. We don't believe that those necessarily only associated with the Church of God International are Christian.
Right. No, we don't.
Are different administrations.
That's right. We do not.
Christ. That some through their own foolishness
Is it?
have communion with
Yeah. Is it possible to be a Christian in God's sight and attend a congregation which is autonomous and independent? Yes, it is. I would never argue with that for a moment. But is it best? You see, because just as an individual may depend on one another and be interdependent, so churches are interdependent as well. Now, in other tapes that you have not yet heard, which will be a part of this series, I have discussed the question of the relationship of the ministry to one another, and how that God gives different gifts to different ministers at different times and different places. And He does not give the same gift to me He gives to Ted Phillips. And He has not necessarily given the same gifts to Ted Phillips He's given to Lauren Chamberlain. Between the two of them, they are more than the sum of the parts. And that one of them can do things that the other one cannot do. If you are an independent church and you just have the one minister, you have not got a complete ministry. You have got what God has given to that person, and that's all you got. And what happens when he goes bad?
Nobody to stop it.
Nobody to correct him. You can. But the problem is, you see, when a local congregation takes in hand to correct its minister, they are probably going to split the church. Because there will be people who like him and people who don't, and away we go. The minister in that circumstance either has to be an autocrat or an employee of the church, of that congregation. Whereas in a church where you have a collective organization like ours, a ministry are a brotherhood of themselves. And as I've explained elsewhere in this seminar, that when we ordain a man, when we credential a man, we accept responsibility for that man and for his behavior and his conduct. We accept the responsibility for these two gentlemen who serve out here as credentialed ministers of the Church of God International. And it's, of course, entirely possible either one of them could do wrong. And as I've said before, if they do wrong, you go talk to them. Explain it to them. If they won't hear you, go take a witness. And if they won't hear you then consult us and the other ministers down in Tyler, the ministerial council. And we'll talk to the other ministers about it. We'll see if we can't help you out with your problem. Because we accept, this is what credentials means, folks. It means that a man who accepts our credentials and to whom we grant credentials, we vouch for that man, we accept responsibility for that man, and he says, I accept the leadership of the Church of God International. I accept the criticism of my colleagues in the ministry. I am a part of this band of brothers, and I accept their criticism, their leadership, and their correction of me. I am subject to the ministry. I am subject to the ministry of the Church of God International as a whole. Now, here's a problem people have with that. I don't know if this has occurred to you. That people are worried about that because they fear, if I can't be independent like that, well, maybe would people be telling me what to do and I'm doing the things that really aren't right or I shouldn't do? Something that I think is easily overlooked in many of us is that there is a profound difference between independence and freedom. Now, we equated the two when we founded this country we live in today. Freedom and independence were the same because the people who were governing us wouldn't give us any freedom. So we had to be independent in order to be free in that political sense. But that doesn't work that way in the church. In the church, you can be quite interdependent with people in the church and yet be free. Your conscience is free. It's what you do is between you and God. Your private sins are your private sins, and your private repentance is your private repentance. And if indeed we are all going to hell in a handbasket, all you have to do is get up and walk out and say to us all, shake off the dust of your feet when you go out the door, if you'd like, to witness against us that you're not going to have part in the bad things that we do. You don't lose your freedom by voluntarily accepting a relationship with other Christians. And see, that is basically what we are. The Christian church, and I don't care what kind of a Christian church it is an association of volunteers. Catholic Church is, and believe it or not, so is the worldwide Church of God. We are fond of bashing them a lot, as though they're not. But the fact of the matter is, those people, how many people you hear were in the worldwide Church of God before? Well, look where you are now, see? Living proof. You can get up and walk out of the worldwide Church of God without having sending a hit team after you. So here you are, you know. It happens. You're free. You can really do it. So independent churches can exist as it goes. I think one of the reasons why churches want to be independent is they want to be free of control. And that's a valid concern, but I'm afraid that more often than not, it's really a smokescreen for the fact that they really want to be free of accountability. You know, being free of control is admirable, as long as what you're not really after is freedom from accountability. And one of the things that the church charter means is that a local church is accountable for what they do according to certain specific standards. And they're accountable to the church as a whole. Not to me, not to Ted, but to the church as a whole. That's what the charter means, and it's also what credentials mean. It means our ministers are accountable and our churches are accountable. Independence, don't have to account to anybody but God. God bless you. Go do your thing. Yes?
I think independence, is fostered basically on whatever level you're talking about. On principle, some sort of principle that someone holds to and no one else holds to. For instance, the Protestants, because of the principles, became independent from the Roman Church. And on a local level, I think an individual who cannot accept the principles, or the other people who cannot accept the principle that he holds here as biblical, has to become independent.
That's right. Well, you know, the Protestant churches, though, even though they declared their independence from Rome, created their own new interdependence with one another. They had to. And so that even the most independent of them, like the Southern Baptists, have formed themselves into an association. Otherwise, how do they create ministers? How do they educate their ministers? How do they, relate? So they even have formed themselves into a loose association. Let me continue on here. Maybe we'll have a little time later for some other questions. The Church of God International is not a federation or association of independent churches. Everybody understand what I mean by that? It's not a federation or association of independent churches. From the outset, it was determined that it would be an integrated church at the international, not just the national, but at the international level. For example, when we went up into Canada, we formed a corporation in Canada up there. But we did not form a separate ministerial council in Canada. The ministry in Canada is not structured apart from or separate from the Church of God International. All that is just a simple corporation so people in Canada can deduct their tax contribution, their contributions they make for income tax purposes. The Church of God International in Canada is as much a part, an integrated part of the Church of God here as this church or any other church in the United States might be along the way. Now, we basically made that pretty clear, I think, from the outset, although I think a few people have maybe either misunderstood it or decided to. It was determined also from the outset that it would be led by a ministry, and it was recognized that there was a hierarchy of influence among the ministry when the ministerial council was originally formed. We formed a ministerial council. We recognize that there are influential, experienced men, and we need to put them into positions where they can be effective in leading the church, which we did. The request for a Church of God International charter involves an acceptance of the leadership of the Church of God International ministry and an alliance with all other churches holding the same charter. That's what these things mean when we're talking in terms of independence. One of the benefits of a charter is that the ministry accepts responsibility for guiding the church and commends that church to others. One of the benefits of a charter, I've already said that, but one of the most destructive forces in the Church of God International today is the presence of those who want to be independent, but also want to act as leaders in CGI chartered churches. Notice the complete statement. They are not a destructive force because they want to be independent. That's harmless. Any individual here says, I want to be independent. I don't want to belong to an organization or anything else. Fine. You're welcome in our fellowship. When it becomes destructive is when you attempt to act as a leader in the Church of God International when you are not committed to the goals and the purposes and the direction of this church as it has been clearly defined for all concerned. And we really have not been that ambiguous about it. We have been careful because we didn't want to offend people whose sensibilities have been wounded by other church organizations. But still, there has never been any question, I think, in any thoughtful person's mind about which direction we're going. And to all of you, I'd like to say, don't let your church be turned aside by those who want to lead, but are not committed to the goals of this church. You follow me? Of your church and of where we're all going. This has happened to us, where we've had a congregation of people, most of whom wanted to be and were committed to the Church of God International, signed a statement saying, we accept the Constitution and bylaws, we accept the guidelines, we are committed to the goals of the church and so forth. And yet later on someone comes along in the local church and wants to exercise leadership who is not committed to those goals and attempts to hijack essentially the church and to take it off in some other different direction. Don't let that happen to your church. And don't just wait for your minister to keep it from happening. You've got to help keep it from happening. I mean, this church is the church of Jesus Christ, and Jesus Christ is active in all of us. And the problems that can exist if the church do not support the minister when the time comes that the church is under attack, not from anybody that really means to do harm, but who means well, but wants to lead off in some other direction. This is destructive. And it will only be handled properly is if you back your minister, whoever he may be, when that time comes. When the time comes and there's a question arises, back him. And if you have a problem, go talk to him afterward and sort it out in private or work it out among the ministry elsewhere. But meanwhile, back your minister. Because if you don't, you're going to be headed for problems and probable division in the church. Those people who want to be independent are welcome guests in our church. They are welcome. And I have no bone to pick with people who want an independent church. Jeff Booth has an independent church up in Amarillo, and those are fine people. And I believe when Christ comes back, a lot of them are going to be caught right up in the air to meet a lot of us at the same time. But they're not committed to our goals, but we have a good relationship with them because they're not trying to pretend that they're part of the CGI when they are not. There are actually committed CGI members who attend there. They're in a minority, but they attend there because it's the closest church to them. And they understand what's going on, and there is no problem, there is no conflict, because everybody understands what everybody stands for in the relationship that they're dealing with there. When people who really want this independence for whatever reason come to a church, the first place they will probably go to work is to undermine the influence of the ministry. It just always happens that way. Read the book of Galatians. You know, it's just evident what happens whenever people come in. They start chipping away, whittling away, carving away at the ministry. They may start with Tyler. They may start with the local pastor. It works both ways, however it happens to go along. But the goal is the same. What I'm saying to you is simply, in simple terms now, as I get ready to conclude this particular passage, this section of the seminar, is that sooner or later, your minister will be attacked. Sooner or later, someone will come along and who will start trying to cause trouble in your local church or start trying to in some way, diminish the influence of your minister in your congregation. And I say to you all, if you value your church, support your minister, because it is in the ministry that Jesus Christ placed the leadership of the church. And those who are concerned about the possibilities of abuse, we have a very large ministry now. We've got well over 50 ministers across the country. We have a ministerial council, we have a structure, and we have a way of handling those things. If it comes to the place where you can't trust the ministry of this church to correct its own, I advise you to look for another church. I advise you to do that, forthwith, because something is very, very bad wrong somewhere. But I commit to you that we as a ministry will take care of our own. And we will support you as a church. We will give you the encouragement and help, hopefully, that you will need. And we will try together to build something that can be very effective in the service of God. Thank you for coming. I appreciate your efforts. I don't know if I'll be able to make my airplane yet, but I am going to try. So thanks for coming and thanks for the extra time. She had written in asking some questions about some of our literature. I sat down and I would try to explain something to her, and I couldn't teach her.